All right, welcome back. So this week, moving on to chapter 5, which is periodization of biomotor abilities. So we should probably start with what biomotor abilities are. Fortunately, this particular one is in the glossary. Not all of the key terms are, but this one is. So biomotor abilities are abilities whereby the body can perform a range of activities such as strength, speed, and endurance. Biomotor abilities are influenced by training and may be genetically determined. So kind of the easiest way to think about biomotor abilities is those are sort of the prerequisites to sport performance. So those include things like muscular strength, muscular endurance, running speed, cardiovascular endurance, agility, those kinds of things. So if we increase our muscular strength or our muscular power, hopefully then that translates to the field or to the court, and that results in improved performance. So the idea here is that we're working on biomotor abilities, the prerequisites for performance, and if we build those up, if we improve those abilities, that should translate to improved performance. So in terms of terminology here, so as you can see there, so periodization can be examined in the context of two important aspects of training. The first is periodization of the annual plan. With respect to periodization of the annual plan, what we're thinking about, or what we're talking about there, is that relationship between volume and intensity. So with periodization of the annual plan, what we're looking at is the load, right? That combination of volume, intensity, and frequency of training, in addition to all the technical and tactical things that we're working on, and possibly some psychological things that we're working on. So all the different parameters of training that we're working on, we're increasing and decreasing the load, varying it throughout the year. That's periodization of the annual plan. And hopefully, if we get that increase in load and that increase and decrease, the fluctuation of load, if we get that right, hopefully that results in peaking of performance when we want it to, whether that's for the biggest game of the season or whether that is for, the conference tournament, that kind of thing. Periodization of biomotor abilities, when we look at these training programs and the ones that you're going to create, hopefully we'll have multiple biomotor abilities that we want to work on. So, if we're thinking about a sport like soccer, basketball, hockey, again, those interval sprint sports, it's great that the athlete is strong, it's great that the athlete is powerful, but they also have to have some level of muscular endurance and some level of aerobic endurance, right? And so we have to work on multiple things at one time. Now, we can't maximize the intensity and the volume of all of those things at one time, right? So we can't do maximal aerobic endurance at the same time that we're doing a maximal load in strength training, at the same time we're doing a maximal load in agility. So what we do with periodization of biomotor abilities is that throughout the annual plan, there's some variation. There are certain times during which we focus on specific biomotor abilities. So for example, we may focus on muscular hypertrophy, or muscular size, if you will, early in the general preparatory phase. At the same time, we're focusing on general aerobic endurance. At the same time, we're focusing on kind of general speed development. So things like form running, making sure that they are efficient and economical in their running. And then later on in the plan, we'll work on maximizing strength, but then we'll really focus on agility rather than endurance, for example. So with periodization of biomotor abilities, there are different emphases during different parts of the annual plan. Sometimes we're emphasizing muscular power, sometimes we're emphasizing anaerobic endurance, sometimes we're emphasizing agility. So that's the idea of periodization of biomotor abilities. So it goes back to that conjugated model that we talked about in chapter 3 or 4, I don't remember which offhand, but we've talked about it previously, and I showed you a table that had the different biomotor abilities, and some of the ones I'll show you later on in this presentation. You'll see that you'll see those multiple emphases that we're working on together, but during particular periods, some of them take precedence over the others. At the bottom part of the slide, that's review. This book goes over the same things repeatedly, which is hopefully good in terms of retention, help you hang on to the information, but there's a lot of rehashing of the same information, and this is no exception. So remember the annual plan, the big three components of the annual plan are the preparatory phase, and the first part of the preparatory phase is general preparatory. So that's when we're doing things like just having the athlete, go out and run for 30 minutes, right? So you're working on general aerobic endurance. and then you have them do 3 sets of 10 of squats in the weight room, for example. And so you're working on muscular hypertrophy and a little bit of muscular strength, right? And so that's part of the general preparatory phase. As we get closer to the season, we shift to the specific preparatory phase. And so in that phase, the exercises come to more closely resemble the movement demands of the sport, and they come to more closely resemble the metabolic demands of the sport. So we may change our rest intervals. So maybe earlier in the program we had pretty long rest intervals, and we may shorten those as we get closer to the season. We may move, the example I've used before is if we're working with an athlete who is a running athlete, we may move from doing a lot of 2-leg stuff to 1-leg stuff because of the flight phase in running. So that's more specific to their sport. So that would be a way that the exercises get more specific to the movement demands. Then we move into the competitive phase. It has 2 subphases. The first is the pre-competitive subphase. So pre-competitive is basically the pre-season. It may also be the non-conference or non-district part of the schedule. So they're the games that don't matter quite as much. So they may literally not be part of your record because they're scrimmages, or they may be games that don't matter as much in terms of your conference or your district standings. And so because of that, it's okay if you, not necessarily okay if you lose, but the idea is that we're working on improving our tactics and we're working on improving the techniques that the athletes utilize in those competitions so that later when we get to ones that do count or are more important, that we'll have those tactical issues ironed out or some of those technique issues ironed out. Then we move into the main competitive phase, which is conference or district, whatever that would be, or potentially the whole season. So this really varies with sport. As I was thinking about this, I was thinking about things like college football, of which I'm a huge fan. And so in college football, particularly, big time Division I, I was looking for like Power 5 type football. With that type of football, you can't really afford to lose a game if you want to be in the playoffs. So even if it is, non-conference, if you're playing, one of the 2 or 3 games that are non-conference games, for the most part, you can't really afford to lose those games if you want to be in the playoffs at the end of the season. So even though those could be classified as pre-competitive because they don't affect your conference standings, the reality is that those fall into the competitive phase. Versus sports with a longer season, something like baseball, if you lose some of those games before conference, those don't really matter as much. So you have a little more leeway there. So then maybe those would fall into the pre-competitive category. The transition phase, the idea there is to remove fatigue, in the author's words. Because remember, as we add up all these training stresses, as we have them spending time in the weight room and running sprints and spending time in film and going to practice, the athletes are going to accumulate both physical fatigue and mental fatigue. They're going to get tired. And so by the end of the season, they're going to be worn out. And so they're going to need to transition before they can start a new annual plan, before they can start training again. And so in the transition phase, we want to get them away from the sport a little bit so that they have time to mentally recover. They're just doing something else for a little while, and also so they have time to physically recover. So that transition phase typically lasts 2 to 4 weeks. Sometimes it's more like 6, but typically it's 2 to 4. And in that time, again, we want them away from the sport so we can remove the mental aspect of it for a little while. Ideally, they would do some sort of exercise, not much. We're going to really reduce the volume and really reduce the intensity. But we want them to do something so that they don't lose all the adaptations that they've made. In the old Soviet system, one of the things that they would do is, with the hockey players, for example, during the transition phase, they would have them do basically recreational soccer. And so the athletes are still getting up, they're still moving. Soccer is a pretty similar game to hockey in a lot of ways. And so, they're not playing hockey, it's not as intense. The volume isn't as high, that kind of stuff, but they're still moving, so they're not losing some of the adaptations that they made during that competitive phase and during the previous preparatory phase. And then once we've allowed them to recover physically, recover mentally, then we can move on into the next annual plan. So the idea here is that the transition phase leads into the next annual plan if we're doing a monocycle, which is 1 peak, which is what we see typically with seasonal athletes. So your standard like football, baseball, basketball, etc. Now, other sports will have multiple peaks, maybe 2 peaks in a bicycle. In this book, which is funny, they always do a bi and then a dash and then cycle, so it doesn't look like bicycle. So in a bicycle, there's 2 peaks. In a tricycle, again, there's a little dash there. There's 3 peaks. So bicycles and tricycles, I'll show you some of those here in a minute. But those we see with athletes involved in, so bicycles you'll see with sports like swimming or tennis, where they have 2 seasons, where there's like a fall season and a spring season, which may be individual and team, depending on your sport. And we see the same kind of thing with track as well, between things like outdoor and indoor. And so in that case, the transition phase would lead into the next preparatory phase, but not the next annual plan, because you got two peaks in 1 year in that case. And so there's the graphic of it. So you've got your preparatory phase here, right? And so you got general preparation, specific preparation, then our macro cycles, which are 2 to 6 weeks. So here's a couple of macro cycles. And then we have our micro cycles, which are our 1-week plans. Okay, so this particular macro cycle is 4 weeks, this particular macro cycle is 3 weeks. Then we move on to specific preparation, same concepts, pre-competitive. So if we're thinking about something like football, the pre-competitive phase, which looks to be 5 weeks here as far as the microcycle setup. So that pre-competitive phase would be something like fall camp. So maybe that starts, last week of July, takes you all the way through August, and then the competitive phase starts in September. So you got competitive September, October, November, and then you move into the transition phase in December, and then start the next annual training plan with your general preparation in the weight room, working up toward spring football, and then into the summer, and then working toward the actual next season. So one of the things here in terms of, so with periodization, there's this sequential approach, right? So we kind of work our way up in intensity and we decrease the volume some. But ultimately what we're doing is we are increasing the overall load as the program progresses. And so with that sequential approach, the reason that we need to do that is that it takes time to improve our performance, right? So it takes the body time to adapt. So for example, in order to make measurable gains in muscle size, that takes 4 to 8 weeks. In order to make to accumulate enough red blood cells to make a difference, that takes about a month, right? And so that takes time. Same kind of thing with increasing capillary density. So generating new capillaries around a muscle cell, that takes 4 to 8 weeks, somewhere in that range. So it takes time to develop those things. And so because of that, let's go with that. Because it takes time, we have to, stay at the same or slightly increase the intensity slowly to allow the athlete to develop. And then once they've made those adaptations, once the muscle size has improved, once they've added capillaries, then they can train at a higher intensity, right? They can lift more weights, they can run a little bit faster, and so those adaptations facilitate an increase in training load after they've been made. The other things on there, so progress requires escalation of specificity, brings about the physical adaptations that lay the groundwork for the next phase. So building on that hypertrophy example, one of the things that we talked about in Structure 1, so in 201, is that there are probably a couple different types of hypertrophy, so muscle growth. So for example, if you do more high volume type of training, so here I'm talking sets of like 8 to 15, somewhere in that range, with that high volume training that, typically we associate with bodybuilders doing fairly high repetition stuff, and then maybe a couple exercises back to back, so compound sets or supersets. That kind of higher volume training increases muscle size, so it particularly increases the size of a muscle cell. But what researchers have found in the last few years with really high volume training is that the increase in size in the muscle cell comes from additional sarcoplasm, so that's the cytoplasm of the muscle cell, not from additional contractile proteins, right? So not from additional actin and myosin. So the muscle cell increases in size, the muscle overall is bigger, but it's because there's more sarcoplasm, there's more fluid inside of the muscle cell. And then if we lift heavier, so if we're doing sets of like 6 and less, or 8 and less potentially, with that higher intensity and lower volume, what we end up with is a slightly different type of hypertrophy. So you add additional actin and myosin, so you add more of the contractile proteins, and so then that's what's going to facilitate an increase in muscle strength, right? So one of the things that happens then is if we start out, that traditional step periodization model that I'm such a big fan of, if we start out with that model where we do sets of 12, work our way down to sets of 10, and we do that for a total of somewhere between 4 to 8 weeks. In doing that higher volume training, what you're doing is you're going to get some muscle growth, right? So you're going to get some hypertrophy, but it's probably that sarcoplasmic growth where you add the additional sarcoplasm to the muscle cell, and then by increasing the total volume of the cell, one of the theories is that sort of lays the groundwork or enables us to more easily add actin and myosin, the contractile proteins, whenever we increase the intensity. So you increase cell volume by doing the high rep stuff, and then you increase the intensity. Now you add more actin and myosin, and so you get a little bit different hypertrophy overall. You've made the muscle cell bigger initially by adding sarcoplasm, and then when you do higher intensity stuff, you add more actin and myosin, and now you get a stronger muscle. So you make a larger muscle cell first, and then you make it stronger. And so that's what ends up happening then if we progress down from sets of 12 to 10 to 8 to 6 to 4 to 2, is that basic progression of increase in muscle size and changes in the muscle cell itself. The last point on there is that realistically, it's not possible to maintain either a physical or psychological peak for a prolonged period of time. So one of the things you've probably noticed in these periodization models is whenever the little peaking curve, it's typically only like 1 to 2 weeks that they're at the top. It takes them a long time to get there, and they're only there for like 1 or 2 weeks. Now, ideally, we'd be there all the time, but if we were, the volume or the training load is probably the more accurate way of saying that. The training load is so high. They're spending so much time preparing for their sport, so practicing and lifting and running and watching film and all those things, that it just becomes, there's so much fatigue that you just can't maintain it. Something's going to break down. Either you're going to be mentally exhausted, physically exhausted, whatever it is, and so your performance is going to drop off. So the reality is that we can't maintain either that physiological or psychological peak for more than a week or two, and then we need a break. We have to remove fatigue. So because of that, what we want to do is plan when we need to hit that peak. So again, for things like the conference championships, for your really important big rivalry game that you can't lose, so Michigan, Ohio State, that kind of thing, we want to peak for those types of events. So as mentioned earlier, different types of training plans. So the monocycle, what each of those means is that there is essentially one, it's the number of peaks, right? So in a monocycle, 1 peak. Bicycle, 2 peaks. Tricycle, 3, and then multiple peak, multis, right? So monocycles are the easiest type of training plan to set up. They're they're actually the most common training plan as well. So those are the ones we want to use with novice and junior athletes. So, athletes kind of in that 18 to 22 age, and then under 18. So that saying junior athletes is, I was specifying 18 to 22 there. So one of the good things about a monocycle, tends to have a pretty long preparatory phase. Depends upon the experience of the athlete. So if you've got, an athlete who is 22, you're maybe not spending 28 weeks in the preparatory phase. Maybe it's a little bit shorter time than that. But in general, the monocycles, again, 1 peak and fairly long preparatory phases. In the bicycle, not bicycle, bicycle. So those are used for your advanced or your elite athletes who can qualify for national championships. So for example, you might see that with something like powerlifting or weightlifting. So like in powerlifting, there's at least collegiate powerlifting, there's a national meet every year somewhere around April. And so oftentimes athletes will set it up so that they will go to a meet in October, November, somewhere in that time frame. And they'll peak, let's say, in November, and hopefully hit a qualifying total to enable them to go to nationals. And then once they hit that qualifying total in November, then they start another cycle So they're trying to hit that second peak for April. So that would be a bicycle. And again, we could see that with sports where there are effectively 2 competitive seasons. So again, outdoor, indoor track, you might see that for swimming, you might see that for tennis, and there are probably some others that I'm not thinking of. Tricycles we typically see for really advanced or international athletes. So here thinking about something like a really advanced track athlete, because this is an Olympic year. Well, it is now because of last year. And so as I'm recording this, all the Olympic trials are on. So a tricycle would be something used by an aspiring Olympic, let's say track athlete, for example, where they are going to try to peak at a qualifying meet, try to peak at either the national championships or the Olympic trials, and then they're going to try to peak at obviously the Olympics, right? So within the span of a year, they're going to have 3 really important meets, and you have to do well in one to get to the next one. So you have to peak as best you can, at that national championships to get to the Olympic trials to get to the actual Olympics. So that would be something like a tricycle where there'd be 3 peaks. And then multi-peak, where we see those are in sports like tennis, but also professional golf, MMA, boxing, those kinds of things, where they may have multiple pretty big tournaments, pretty big meets per year, but they're not spaced so far apart, like in the track example, where there's only 3 of them and they maybe have 3 or 4 months between. In the multi-peak, they may have 2 or 3 weeks between. So it's not quite enough to like go through a full cycle of preparatory phase, recovery, etc. They're really condensed and they're really close. So that would be a multiple peak model. So a type of training I'm not as familiar with. I'm most familiar with the monocycle. All right. So in terms of periodizing biomotor abilities, you can see 3 different biomotor abilities there on this one. So you've got the anatomical adaptation, maximum, so I'm reading on the top line here. I should probably pull my mouse up. All right, so we got strength is one of our biomotor abilities. And so in the general preparatory phase, we're going to do anatomical adaptation. And so that is basically that sarcoplasmic hypertrophy I was talking about. So that's when you're going to do your sets of somewhere between 8 and 12 to try to make the muscle cell bigger. Then we're going to increase the intensity, so we're going to be in the maximum strength phase. So now that the muscle cell is bigger, we're going to make it stronger, so we're going to do sets of somewhere between 4 and 8. The slides I'm going to show you here in a minute vary a little bit from the numbers I'm giving you. So there is a little bit of leeway in the numbers, but in general, maximum strength is kind of in that 4 to 8 range. And then conversion is kind of 4 or less. So what conversion is, so the idea is that you're going to make the muscles bigger, you're going to make them stronger, and then we have to convert that muscle strength to a sort of muscle action that's useful in sport, right? So just because you're strong doesn't mean that you're going to be a really good soccer player. But if we can convert that muscular strength to muscular power, so being able to generate force really quickly, that's kind of the easiest way to conceptualize power, lots of force in a little period of time, that's going to help you accelerate. It's going to help you jump, it's going to help you sprint, all that kind of stuff. And so in the conversion phase, what we're doing is we're trying to convert muscular strength to muscular power, for the most part. And so what we're going to do there is we're going to increase the intensity. So we can do things like really heavy lifting. So you can do, again, sets of 4 or less. Typically it's 3 or less. So pretty heavy weight, probably somewhere, 90% of your 1 rep max or higher. And so in doing that, you're training the nervous system to recruit all the motor units. And as you get to, doing your 1 rep max, now you're going to be engaging in rate coding. The other thing we can do, so in conversion we can lift really heavy, so greater than 90% of our 1 rep max, or we can lift really fast. So the typical loads there are 20 to 40% of your 1 rep max, so pretty light weights, but you're moving them as fast as possible for a small number of repetitions, so like 1 to 3 repetitions typically. So either really explosive movements or really heavy movements. That's the way that we convert muscular strength to muscular power. We'll talk about muscular endurance here in a minute. And then for endurance, so cardiovascular standpoint, so we'll do kind of a general aerobic endurance. And so we'll just have them go out and, run or ride the bike, Depends on our sport, because this is a pretty generic periodization strategy. So run, ride the bike, etc. And then maybe we'll have them, so with specific endurance, if we're doing somebody like, or training somebody like a hockey player, so maybe here we had them run or ride the bike to try to give their adductors, their groin muscles, a rest, because those tend to get overloaded across the course of a hockey season. And so we do kind of general stuff here, and then we do this combination here. So maybe they're still doing some running, they're still doing some riding the bike, and then now they're starting to skate a little bit. So they're not doing change of direction stuff, but maybe they're doing, just some light, end-to-end, like linear type of stuff. And then as we get closer to the pre-competitive part, now we're going to do more change of direction. We're going to work on different, crossovers, different like mohawks, backwards skating, that kind of stuff. So as we get closer, we're going to get closer to that sport endurance. And then with speed stuff, so early in the speed phase, as I'll show you here in a minute, typically you're really working on their form. So maybe we're doing some really light, like skating form stuff here, if we're sticking with the hockey example. And then here for HIIT, and usually you'll see 2 I's, so high intensity interval training. Sometimes it's just HIIT, high intensity training, they leave off the interval. But as you can see, typically it's interval based, so it's usually HIIT, high intensity interval training. And so there, if you're working on things like anaerobic power, so that is being able to capitalize upon and improve the ATP phosphocreatine system. And so for example there, what we might do is like a 10-second sprint, 10-second rest, or maybe a 20-second sprint, 20-second rest. And so if we do longer work than we do rest, now we're also working on lactate tolerance. So it just depends on what it is that we want to do. If we do relatively short rest intervals, so if we do like let's do 10-second sprint, 10-second rest, that's also going to work on your anaerobic endurance. You're going to generate some lactate, but not as much as you would if you're doing 20-10. And so because of that, you're able to recover a little bit more effectively. And then we're going to do specific speed and agility. So specific speed is what they actually use in the sport. So maybe that is, from a stop, again, sticking with the hockey example, from a stop on the goal line, you're going to have them, do a quick start and then stop at the, let's say stop at the blue line and then come back. So that's working on more specific speed. Agility would be, different types of like slaloming through the cones, that kind of stuff for a hockey player. All right. So similar setup here, because this one's for a figure skater, so similar idea. So we're going to have her do running and bicycling for her general endurance, and then again that combination of running and skating, but she's probably not going to be doing jumps or anything, just like some basic skating, forward, backward. And then to do more specific stuff, she's going to do similar work rest intervals to what she would do during a routine. So maybe she does, 30 seconds of pretty high intensity stuff with 10-15 seconds of rest. Not sure what the work rest intervals are on figure skating, but probably something similar to that. And so that would be the transition here during the period of endurance. And then here's a baseball one. This one's pretty similar. There weren't a lot of things I wanted to add on this one. So trying to think what else. Yeah, not a lot of additions here. Just one of the things with baseball that becomes challenging is the length of the season and the fact that they play every day. That's actually probably the most challenging thing about working with baseball. So you're not able to really vary the intensity as much because, they could play today. If we're thinking about somebody like a position player, if it's like a starting pitcher, you have a little bit more ability to vary the intensity and the volume. But if it's somebody like a position player, like your second baseman, probably going to play most days. Or if you have, a backup player, you don't want to just go in and wear them out, and then tonight's the night they actually get into the game and they're too fatigued. So baseball is really challenging from that standpoint because they do play pretty much every day. All right. So now periodization of different biomotor abilities in turn. So in terms of periodization of strength, so a lot of this is the same kind of stuff I talked about a minute ago. So the first part's anatomical adaptation. So we want to make the muscle bigger. That's our anatomical adaptation. And so in addition to making the muscle bigger, we're also laying down additional collagen around the muscle cell itself. So you're thickening the endo, epi, and perimysium, so those layers of connective tissue around the muscle itself. You're thickening the tendon. And then in addition to that, you are increasing, or let's just stick with thickening the ligaments in the joints that you're training as well. So those are additional pieces of anatomical adaptation. But the main thing that we're going for is increasing the size of the muscle. That doesn't have to be a ton, right? Our athletes aren't all bodybuilders, but everything else being equal, a larger muscle is a stronger muscle. So we do want to add some additional size. So that's the first part of this. So it's pretty high volume stuff. So again, between 8 and 20 repetitions for 3 sets. Relatively low intensity, between 40% and 65% of your 1 rep max. Personally, I don't usually have athletes, unless they're younger athletes, like middle schoolers, I don't have them do more than sets of 12. 12 is kind of like my ceiling for most athletes. And by saying that, so now you're probably maybe 55% of their 1 rep max, maybe more like 60. But I wouldn't do anything in the 40% range unless you're doing speed work. But, different schools of thought. So as far as the textbook goes, they're doing in this range. For our beginner athletes or our younger athletes, so, your middle schoolers, early high school, ideally we want the anatomical adaptation phase to be fairly long. Because they have a lot of adaptations that they can make, because they are, probably have relatively little muscle mass, and so they've got a lot of room for improvement. And so that anatomical adaptation phase may be as long as 12 weeks. And then as they get more experience, maybe it's only like 2 to 4. So we're making the muscle bigger there, and then we're going to make the muscle stronger. So now we are reducing the volume a little bit. So rather than being high volume, we're doing moderate volume, and we've increased the intensity, so moderate intensity. So 3 sets of between 2 and 6 repetitions, between 70 and 80% of your 1 rep max. I think 2 reps is a little low, personally. So again, I would go with more like the 4 to 8 repetition range for this. And so you're probably going to get as high as 85% of your 1 rep max. And then later in the maximal strength phase, we can do low volume, high intensity, so 3 sets of 1 to 3 reps, 80% of their 1 rep max or higher. And again, this goes right into that conversion phase. So that low volume, high intensity stuff, heavy weights, heavy weights, relatively low number of sets, can then lead into high intensity. Can lead into conversion. So the other thing, I'm kind of thinking ahead as I'm talking here, which is why I messed that up. Another thing there is that this is typically where you start to incorporate like the Olympic movements. So if you're thinking about, the Olympic lifts are the snatch and the clean and jerk. And then a lot of the things that we do in the weight room with our athletes are variants of those, right? So as athletes, many of you have probably done power cleans, or you've seen them done. So power cleans, power snatches, overhead squats, those kinds of things. Those are all variants or pieces of the Olympic lifts. And so usually we start to work in those variants of the Olympic lifts kind of in here. So you don't want to do those Olympic lifts, so things like a power clean, you don't want to do those for more than like 5 repetitions, because part of the idea there is to move the weight fast, and any sort of a powerful exercise, and again, if we're trying to move fast, we're heading toward conversion here. We're trying to convert muscular strength to the specific speed of sport. So if we're doing a powerful movement, like a power clean, power snatch, high pulls, that kind of stuff, we don't want to do any more than 5 repetitions, and typically we're going to do more like 3 or less. So it is 1 to 3 repetitions, move it as fast as you can, and lift a weight as heavy as you can. That's typically the way you want to do those movements. And I say that because oftentimes you'll see coaches do or think, well, the Olympic lifts are good, and they are, and so they'll do fairly high volume with them. So for example, from 20 plus years ago, when I was in school and we were doing football training, the coaches made us do sets of 10 and 12 of power cleans, which suck, and defeats the purpose, but they also made us do them on a count. So they would have everybody in the weight room, whether you're doing squat, bench press, power cleans, or incline press, the coach would go 1 and everybody would go. Well, you can't do, power cleans take a little bit longer to do than a bench press, and so it became really tough to do it on those counts too. So don't do, all of that is to say, don't do high volume stuff with the Olympic lifts. Don't do more than 5 repetitions. If you want to increase the volume on those, just do more sets. So rather than doing only 3 sets, maybe you're going to do more like 8 sets. And it depends upon the maturity of the athlete, but that's one of the ways that you can do that. Because you'll see that some too, where when people are doing really heavy stuff or really fast stuff, they'll do as many as like 8 sets, but it's relatively low repetitions, 1 to 3. All right, enough about that. So conversion to specific strength. So again, we're taking that muscular strength and we're making it into muscular power. So we're going to enable the muscle to contract quickly, right? And so what we're doing there, again, generally low volume, high intensity. So high intensity meaning either heavy weight or light weight moved really fast. So you're either doing 80% or more of your 1 repetition max for 3 or less, or you're doing 20 to 40% of your 1 repetition max for 3 or less, and you're just moving it really fast. So that includes things like the explosive movements like squat jumps, and you can do squat jumps with the trap bar. So obviously this athlete is in that maximal strength phase, but if we take a bunch of this weight off and have him do like an actual jump squat or jump pull with this trap bar, then that would be more of the conversion phase, and that would be an explosive movement. Other things like bench press throws, you can do those if you've ever seen a Smith machine where the barbell is actually on 2 poles and it slides up and down. You can do bench press throws on that. You can do medicine ball throws. This is where you start to see like where people do those twists and they throw the ball into the wall, or they do medicine ball slams. Plyometrics come in here. So if we're doing things like box jumps, if we're doing there's a push-up variant on this I'm trying to think of, like clap push-ups, those would be an explosive type movement, right? Other things that we can do, banded movements. So, and you'll see, yeah, I was going to say chains, but typically chains are actually up here in the maximal strength phase. So you can do banded movements where you attach a rubber band or jump stretch band to the ends of the barbell, like on squats or bench press, and you just try to move the bar as fast as you can, and obviously the band is going to slow that movement down once you get to the top. And then the Olympic lifts as well. All right, and then once we get into the season, typically what you're going to see in the season is that muscular strength and muscle power drop. So really the name of the game in season is to hang on to the gains that you've made. So in season, and here I'm thinking of your team sport athletes, again, football, basketball, soccer, baseball, hockey, etc. So in season, the athletes typically train 1 to 3 times per week, 2 to 5 exercises, 2 to 4 sets, and then 1 to 6 repetitions. So it is a relatively low number of reps. You're not often in there doing sets of 10 or 12 or whatever. But the key to maintaining the gains that you've made is to maintain intensity. So it's not about the number of repetitions. It's not as much about the number of sets. It is about either lifting heavy weights. So again, 80%, or as you can see there, 80% of your 1 rep max or higher. Or it's about lifting light weights fast. So that's the way that we hang on to the gains that we've made. So they may only make it into the weight room 1 time. For somebody like a basketball player late in the season. And so what we'll do then is we'll have them do, like the big lift. So we're going to have them do things like squats, some kind of a press, maybe some Olympic variant, so commonly power cleans, and then something else, right? And so we're going to have them either, maybe they're squatting heavy and they're doing heavy power cleans, and then they're doing really fast presses, some iteration thereof. So you either got to move fast or you got to lift heavy weights during the season to maintain the improvements that you've made. Because one of the things you'll see coaches do sometimes is the basic rationale is like, well, we want to hang on to our strength, but by lifting weights, we're adding fatigue, right? And so what we want to do then is reduce some of that fatigue, so we'll have the athlete do sets of 10 or 12. Well, what you've done there is you've lowered the intensity, and so now you're not engaging the biggest motor units, you're not engaging those type 2X fibers, and so those fibers are going to become detrained, and that's going to lead you to lose strength and lose power later in the season, which we don't want. The cessation phase is where you stop lifting. Depends on the sport. So particularly if we're thinking about sports that go to like a conference tournament or a conference meet, they may stop lifting 5 to 7 days prior to the competition. Maybe a little bit longer if we're thinking about somebody like an endurance athlete, maybe a cross-country runner stops lifting a little bit farther out. But if we're thinking of somebody like a shot putter or a discus thrower, they're going to lift maybe 2-3 days before the competition to make sure that they hang on to the strength that they have. So that cessation, when they stop lifting, can vary pretty significantly. So maybe you just reduce the volume. So rather than having them do 3 sets of 5, you have them do 1 set of 5. Or just have them do some really fast movements. The compensation phase, remember that one of the things that these authors talk about a lot is that when we taper down, when we reduce the volume, when we reduce the intensity, and thus the total training load, you're going to get some super compensation. So after you reduce volume and intensity for 7 to 10 days, you're going to see this effect where muscular strength, muscular power, endurance, those kind of things actually improve a little bit. And so that's our compensation phase. And then related to the transition, working on muscles not primarily used during the competitive phase. So one of the things we can have them do during the transition, because I mentioned that we want to have them still doing something most of the time. So we can have them do things where they start to, if you're a soccer athlete, that's a very quad dominant sport. So we have them start like working on hamstring strength. So working on those underused muscles from the competitive phase. All right, so other things. So, and you're probably familiar with this from biomechanics, but power is, the easiest way to think about it is power is moving fast. So the actual equation is power is work over time, or power is, and so work is force times displacement. So if we're thinking about something like lifting weights, the force is how much weight are you lifting? Displacement is how far is it moving. So if you do a squat, maybe the bar moves 24 inches and you're lifting 200 pounds, and then you divide that by time and that gives you your power, right? So, but again, the easiest way to conceptualize powerful movements are ones that occur fast. So I mentioned that because there are some sports like powerlifting where the name itself is kind of a misnomer. So powerlifting, the competitive lifts are squat, bench press, and deadlift. You lift as much weight as you can, try to get the highest total that you can. And the way those lifts are performed, because you're lifting the heaviest weight that you can handle, the weights move really slow. So it's actually not a powerful movement, despite the name. So with agility, one of the things I want to highlight about agility is that agility is dependent upon the athlete's strength. So an athlete who is stronger, who can handle a higher percentage of their, I was mixing up 2 examples there, sorry. But an athlete who is stronger, let's say they can squat twice their body weight. Because they can lift double body weight, they're going to be able to better control their body weight during change of direction type stuff, which is what agility relates to. So agility is dependent upon muscular strength. The better you can handle your body weight, the more agile you're going to be, the easier it's going to be to change direction. And then movement time is being able to move a limb quickly, so punching in boxing or kicking in martial arts, or serving in something like our racket sports. In terms of the periodization of speed, so that's all the strength stuff. So now moving on to speed. The general way that develops is that we first work on general speed. So the idea there is that we improve their form. Is a big part of this. So my athlete there that's doing skipping, so working with the athlete to spend a lot of time working on form running stuff. So skipping, arm movements, some plyometrics, those kinds of things. Not high volume plyometrics because you're early in the preparatory phase, but doing some kind of skips and hops and those kinds of things. And then we're also going to have them work on things like towing, uphill running, so that they are able to increase their strength a little bit, because that's really what you're working on there, is you're increasing the strength of hip extension, knee extension, and plantar flexion if you're both towing or uphill running. And so then those translate to being able to increase ground reaction forces, being able to push off harder. So that's what happens in general speed. You're working on technique, and then you're working on increasing stride length, really, so how hard you can push off the ground. And we do that through towing and uphill running are two of the most common ways, or sled pushing is another way that you can do that. We move from there, once we're stronger, or once the athlete is stronger and we've worked on their form, now we start working on their acceleration. So then we have them start to do some short sprints, so 5 to 30 meters, pretty high intensity, so basically all out for 5 to 30 meters, and then relatively long rests, so 1 to 4 minutes. We can have them do some shorter uphill sprints, so again, maybe 10, 20 meters, and then the reason you're going to do lightweight sled towing here is because, again, we're trying to move fast. So if we do some heavy stuff, then we're going to slow them down, which is not what we're going for here. The bottom thing, tempo training, there are some chapters from a book that I'll have to scan in that'll be useful when we talk about endurance training. So there's a really useful book if you're interested in developing good endurance athletes. I was going to say good runners, but you could use the basic equations with any type of endurance athlete. And so the book is called Jack Daniel's Running Formula. And so it's named for the guy who wrote it. It's a running coach. He's an exercise physiologist, and fun fact, he got his PhD at Madison. So it's a really useful book, but for him, and kind of let's go with that. For him, tempo training is runs of approximately 20 minutes with a heart rate somewhere between 88 and 92% of your max. And so basically what you're doing is you're accumulating a good amount of lactate, but not enough so that you will have to stop, but you're starting to accumulate a pretty good amount of lactate. You're working above your lactate threshold, and then so you run for 20 minutes at that pace. Again, let's say 90% of your heart rate max. Run at that pace for 20 minutes. Then you run a little bit slower, so somewhere around 65% of your heart rate max, I think that's the number, for about 10 minutes, and then you do it again. So that's tempo training. So it works on lactate turnover. And so if we can work on lactate turnover, that'll help in the next phase of training when we are trying to recover, and that'll actually help more with this phase, sorry. So the next thing, maximum speed phase, so you're working the ATP phosphocreatine system. So still short sprints, a little bit longer than we were doing in the acceleration phase, long rests. So here you're working on just moving as fast as they can. You're working on maximum speed. So because we want maximum speed, we want to move as fast as they can, we want them to recover between all of the repetitions. So that's where you're going to have pretty long rests. So you do, a 40, 50 meter sprint, just all out, 3-minute rest, 4-minute rest. That's a pretty long time between rest. So really we're focusing on the quality of the repetitions there. The maximum speed phase, there is some effect on injury prevention. If you work on running as fast as you can, for example, that may help you with reducing injury rates or reducing hamstring injury rates, that kind of thing. Anaerobic endurance. So again, the idea here is to increase lactate tolerance, which is the same kind of thing with that repetition training I was talking about. So how do we refer to it? Tempo training. You'll see it tempo and rep training sometimes used interchangeably. So same kind of thing with that tempo training I was just talking about. So here we're still doing relatively short sprints, but we've decreased the rest time. So you can see the sprints are the same distance, but the rest has been cut in half or less. And so we're trying to, with anaerobic endurance, we're not allowing them to recover fully. Maximum speed, we want full recovery, high quality. Anaerobic endurance, we want partial recovery, and because we're only getting partial recovery, we know we're getting a little bit lower quality. But the reality is that in sports, those interval sprint sports, soccer, basketball, hockey, you're not going to get full recovery. They're going to sprint, to go after a ball or to get back on defense, and then they're going to be able to rest and kind of walk or move, do some lateral shuffles, those kinds of things for 30 seconds, maybe a minute, then they're going to have to sprint again. And so the idea here in this anaerobic endurance phase is to develop that specific that specific type of endurance and those work-rest intervals that are similar to what we're going to see in their actual sport. And then endurance training itself. So if we've got an athlete that is, a longer distance swimmer, maybe they swim the 1,500 meters, or we've got a cross-country runner, or we've got a triathlete or a long-distance cyclist, that would be somebody who needs, or those would be people who need to work on aerobic endurance. So with this, the base training, so the general preparation, is pretty long. And so with the general preparatory phase, oftentimes they are doing fairly low intensity stuff for those 1 to 3 months. And so in doing that relatively low intensity stuff, they're going to make a lot of these adaptations in the slow twitch fibers and in some of the type 2A fibers. So what you're going to see, the adaptations to endurance training include increased capillarization, which means more capillaries around individual muscle cells, so more capillaries around your type 1 fibers and your 2As, more mitochondria, so increased number and volume of mitochondria inside those same fibers, increased citric acid cycle enzymes, which are the citric acid cycle is inside of the mitochondria. That's where we talked about, I think back with chapter 1, where we generate carbon dioxide, and also where we generate a lot of those hydrogens that we're going to run through the electron transport chain to make ATP, and then we use oxygen to get rid of the byproducts, to get rid of those hydrogens. So we have more of the enzymes to allow more citric acid cycles to run simultaneously to allow us to produce more hydrogens, which then we can attach to the oxygens that we can get to the cell better because we have more capillaries. Myoglobin is kind of like hemoglobin. So remember, hemoglobin is the protein in the red blood cells that actually binds to oxygen and transports it. Myoglobin is a similar protein inside of muscle fibers. So it's an iron-containing protein that binds to oxygen. Basically, it acts like a shuttle bus, and so it takes oxygen from just after it's diffused into the cell from the capillary. It'll then pick up that oxygen and take it to the mitochondria, which is where we're going to use that oxygen. So a lot of different adaptations in the muscle cell that allow us to use oxygen more effectively or to deliver oxygen more effectively to the cell. In the cardiovascular system, same kind of thing. So we're going to have increased cardiac output. Cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped by the heart per minute. We don't have any change in maximal heart rate, but what we do have a change in is stroke volume. So the heart's able to pump more blood with every beat. And so due to that increase in stroke volume, because of a more extensible and more elastic left ventricle in particular, and a slight thickening of the left ventricular wall, it's able to pump harder. Well, two things. It's able to hold more blood, and it's able to contract more strongly, and so it can eject more blood with each beat, which means then that it increases its stroke volume. And then eventually we get an increase in blood volume. So initially there's going to be an increase in plasma volume. So as mentioned before, that can happen after as few as one workout. You'll see a slight increase in plasma volume. But then over the course of the next month or two, you're going to see a small increase in red blood cells as well to match that increase in plasma volume. So you're going to get an increase in total blood volume after a couple months. And then, because you can deliver oxygen more effectively and use oxygen more effectively, you get an increase in VO2 max, which is your aerobic capacity. So again, the easiest way to conceptualize aerobic capacity is the ability to deliver and use oxygen. And so we get improvements in the delivery system. And then we get improvements in the muscle, which is where we use the oxygen. So all of those, or those two things, then add up to a higher aerobic capacity. So once we've established that aerobic base, then we start working on more specific endurance for their event. So that may be things like those tempo runs. So if you have an athlete that has longer races, somebody that's a 5K or a 10K athlete, they're going to do a lot of tempo type runs to enhance their lactate turnover, because that's going to be an important quality for their event. If we have an athlete that does, maybe they're a miler, we have them do kind of shorter sprints, shorter distances. So maybe they do like 400 and 800 type intervals. So let's go with short intervals there. So again, 400s, 800s, those kinds of things. And so if they're doing something like a 400, or maybe even as short as a 200, we're having them work on their running economy. And then the longer we go, now we're working on lactate threshold and turnover. And then there's an additional pace that I forgot about. But anyway, so that's working on then specific endurance. With our athletes, again, our interval sprint athletes, there's another way rather than just straight running or just straight skating that we can have them work on this. So you can do things that mimic the sport. It's not exactly the same, but you can do things where you have them do, I forget what they call this, the soccer track, I think. So for your soccer athlete, you have them doing hurdle jumps, and then they're going to dribble the ball, right? So again, similar to the types of things they're going to do in their sport. Then they're going to sprint. Then they're going to do some change of direction. They're going to shoot. Then they're going to go over here, do some more dribbling, shoot, quick feet apparently. Then they're going to sprint and sprint, right? And so the idea there is that it's going to be similar to the set of movements that they're doing in a game, and then we can have them run through that a few times. So it's not the same old just boring running with set work rest intervals. It is, again, more specific to their sport. And you can do this with a variety of different sports, right? You can see how this would be pretty easy to adapt to, basketball or hockey or field hockey, those kinds of things. So, and we're going to do this probably you wouldn't do this during training camp. So you wouldn't do this in the couple weeks before the season, but this would be in that specific preparatory phases where you would probably do something like this. And then, sorry for the low quality of this graphic, but this is me taking a picture with my phone and then uploading it, so not great, but readable. So you can see how they're periodizing different things. So we got speed, strength, mental training, nutrition, and then how those change during each of the different phases. So that's kind of putting everything together. And then when we get to chapter 8, you're going to see some really complicated iterations of this that have the addition of volume and intensity and peaking curves and that kind of stuff. But this is kind of that integrated, because obviously you're working on a bunch of different things at one time. So this is sort of a putting it all together. So that's it for chapter 5. Next time we'll move on to chapter 6. So we'll see you then.